Welcome to St. Paul School of Theology. I think I will come up here so that you won't have to turn your heads. Yeah. Welcome to St. Paul School of Theology. It is so good to have you here for our very first forum of the academic year. Yay! Yeah, and I'm thankful because we have technology that is able to connect everyone on all of our campuses, plus our guests from all over the country. So welcome everyone from all over the country. Welcome everyone here at St. Paul. Today we have our presenter is Dr. Joshua Bartholomew, who is the Assistant Professor of Ethics, Church and Society. Yes, and he is going to present to us Black Theology and the Black Panthers, Economic Liberation from the Margins. So without further ado, we have Dr. Bartholomew.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited and honored to be here. I will begin my presentation today by setting up this PowerPoint. Okay. So once again, good afternoon. I look forward to sharing and learning with you this afternoon. My presentation is entitled Black Theology and the Black Panthers, Economic Liberation from the Margins. As the title of this forum suggests, my work deals with the relationship between economic justice and racial equality. Now, you may be asking, what do Black theology and the Black Panther Party have to do with economic justice? Well, today, we're going to fill in those important gaps to show the inseparable connection between the history of Black liberation theology and the Black struggle for economic justice. We'll begin by centering the work of James Cone, the father of Black theology, and the historical context in which our conversation today proceeds. We'll then talk about the need for economic theory to inform the development of Black theological discourse. And then we'll explore a history of economic praxis that I claim we must reclaim and reposition today for visions of a just global society. I also offer a definition of the key term for our conversation today that should be helpful to keep us on the same page when talking about economic justice. So as you can all see, I define economic justice as a fundamental aspect of social justice that is concerned with individuals and groups receiving a just share of the burdens and benefits of social cooperation, particularly as these pertain to allocation of resources, distribution of wealth, alleviation of poverty, and the right to participate in the economy, meaning to engage in meaningful work, which I'll talk about later, without discrimination. So I wrote my book because Black liberation theology, as a platform for Christian social ethics, has its roots in the US Black Power movement of the late 1960s and 70s. While Black liberationist ethics remains a radical response from Black Christians to the mainstream of white religious history, scholars had yet to fully establish an economic model of social justice that develops Cone's initial theological formulations of Black power. For Black power, racial politics of liberation refers to economic and political self-determination for Black people and for all people around the world. And the most revolutionary example of racial politics for Black liberation during and after the Black Power movement was arguably the Black Panther Party. Therefore, by highlighting the economic and political praxis of the Black Panthers, I wrote my book to show that the Panthers' overall strategies of self-determination through Black socialist praxis would prove to be one of the most impactful precedents of racial politics in US history that needs to inform liberationist ethics. My book is the first ethic of resistance that builds upon principles of Black socialism and offers an alternative to capitalism that is missing from Black liberationist and womanist discourse. As womanist scholars argue, if Black women are liberated and lifted up, then surely everyone else will be. Therefore, I used a womanist meta-ethnography, highlighting voices of former Panther leaders like Angela Davis and Elaine Brown, to be critical of the Panthers' patriarchy, critiquing not only their gender and sexual politics, but the patriarchal culture and spirit of the Black Power movement. I also centered womanist themes from Kelly Brown Douglas and Jacqueline Grant to frame a Christian ethic of economic liberation. And Joan Martin's reading of enslaved women's relation to work guided my approach to a labor ethic. The goal of my book and this presentation is to show that normative Eurocentric models of economics are morally bankrupt, in contrast to Black liberationist modes of praxis. A guiding premise for Black liberation is that capitalism cannot and will not improve the lives and conditions of all people. In an anti-Black racist society, there are two main historical problems with the modern capitalist modality. First, it's highly individualistic. It confines all theories of agency to the individual as the ultimate entity in society, both neglecting processes of racialization in society and facilitating a reductionist approach to what kind of decisions people can make within a free market. The second problem, which is related to the first, is the way modern capitalist relations make sense of the idea of freedom. Liberal, neoclassical economists believe that their conception of a free market will solve social ills. To them, a free market entails equal freedom to decide what to do with a monetary budget. People are equally free to make their choices given the budget constraints that they face. However, their conception entails no consideration of race, class, gender, and differing sets of opportunities within a free market. Instead, its view of freedom consists of freedom from something, whereas most Marxists and socialists focus not on whether people are equally free from something, but whether people have the same kinds of opportunities, the freedom to become or to do. In the US, Black liberationists understand that patriarchy, racism, and poverty are not preordained. They're largely the outcome of specific institutional structures in a racialized society. In other words, the methods supporting capitalism's injustices, quote unquote, human nature's unchecked pursuit of self-interest, is a modern social construct. Now, although capitalism is not the prominent topic in Black and womanist theologies, it has always played an instrumental role in shaping the social problems of Black communities. The impact of capitalism for Black people can be seen as early as the enslavement of ethnic peoples from Africa for the purpose of forced labor in the Western world. According to historian and former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, the very existence of British capitalism, which is the model and parent of capitalism everywhere, depended upon the slave-grown cotton of the United States. To speak of American slavery or of the Black slave experience in the United States is to speak indirectly on its traditional capitalist context. Thus, slavery and capitalism are symbiotically related. The system of racism became the consequence of slavery, utilized to preserve a status quo that commodifies Black bodies in our capitalist society. My book is a response to this reality for Black communities. While Black theologians don't represent a monolithic body of thought, Black liberationists challenge racism and also care about the ways in which oppression is embedded within the capitalist spirit and application. In this way, for Black liberationists, privileging the role of Black experience and experience in general for theological construction becomes a modality not just for analysis of racism as social sin, but also of capitalism through notions of classism and economic exploitation as fundamental theological sources of oppression and God's revelation. Now, while Cone did not systematically develop an alternative model to counter capitalism, his earliest work, Black Theology and Black Power, did reject the white lie that Black laziness and inferiority caused poverty, Black poverty in particular. In My Soul Looks Back, Cone constructed an explicit link between economically marginalized people and God's revelation, where he claimed that for the church to have its experience be valid for determining God's will, it must be in concrete solidarity with poor persons who are struggling for freedom. Womanists have also critiqued capitalism as an issue of racism. In Katie's canon, Katie Cannon asserts that the evil of modern racism gets its distinctive shape from the capitalist structure of labor exploitation. My book continues these works and the works of other liberationists, not only by critiquing capitalism, but also by articulating a concrete approach to justice by constructively bringing the Black Panther Party and their model of praxis into the discourse of Black theological ethics. As one of the most trenchant critics of American racism, imperialism, and economic exploitation, the Black Panther Party became the most widely known Black activist political organization of the late 1960s. Founded in 1966 in Oakland, California, by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers were innovative community activists who applied civic laws of self-defense against manifestations of systemic racism, advocating politics of self-determination as tactics of freedom for Black communities around the world. Notorious for wearing distinctive Black leather jackets and Black berets, and often openly displaying weapons. The need to build self-sustainable, interconnected communities from the margins of society influenced the intellectual and socio-political philosophies of the Panthers. As members of a long tradition of Black people in the struggle for freedom, the Panthers were most of all a revolutionary Black American socialist organization whose radical views of racial justice laid an important foundation for moral visions of a just global society. It's necessary to note that the public image of the Black Panther Party was preeminently masculinist, often affirming hierarchies in the realm of sex and gender relations that they militantly challenged in the area of race relations. The Panthers' founding, early history, and ongoing struggles as a male-oriented organization affected everyone who subsequently joined their ranks. Over time, most of the rank-and-file members of the Panthers were women. However, male supremacy persisted. The Black women who increasingly joined the Panthers were far more active than the men, enforcing the Panthers to focus on critical gender and sexuality concerns. As more women joined the Panthers, modeling a mixed gender organization that practiced gender and sexual equality remained a hard-fought battle and elusive goal. However, as more and more Black women joined the Panthers, their work and leadership helped shape the entirety of the Panthers' politics. First publicized in May of 1967, the Black Panther Party's original 10-point program covered demands that were essential to survival. They believed that Black people would not be free until Black people were able to determine their destiny. And they believed in reparations and cooperative economics. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April of 1968, the Panthers picked up where King's Poor People campaign left off, but with a socialist twist. At this point, the civil rights practice of nonviolence against racial exclusion had few obvious targets and could no longer generate massive and widespread participation. The Panthers filled the vacuum, both locally and internationally, frequently helping poor and Black communities with problems with landlords, spousal abuse, or the police, and filing for status as an official non-governing organization of the United Nations. Chapters sprang up all over the US, from LA to New York. From 1967 to 1971, the Panthers' politics of armed self-defense and revolutionary community services gave them political leverage, forcibly contesting the legitimacy of the United States and providing a culture of self-defense for disenfranchised Black people. Even though they structured their ranks like a paramilitary force, they were not just about armed action. The Panthers were a legitimate voice of Black people and took care of a broad range of the community's needs. They considered themselves to be the vanguard party of the Black Power revolution. By the fall of 1968, the Black Panther Party announced its intention to launch the Free Breakfast for Children program in Oakland, one of its core and most notable community programs. By April of 1969, the Panthers reported feeding more than 1,200 children per day at 9 facilities in California, Illinois, and Iowa. By November, the program spread to 23 cities nationwide. And at the height of the effort, between 1969 and 1971, virtually all chapters ran a Free Breakfast for Children program at some point. While children ate their meals, members taught them liberation lessons, consisting of political education and Black history. From August of 1969 through August of 1970, the Panthers developed an array of community programs in chapters throughout the country. These programs included the Free Breakfast for Children program, liberation schools, free health clinics, the Free Food Distribution program, the Free Clothing program, child development centers, the Free Shoe program, the Free Busing to Prison program, the Sickle Cell Anemia Research Foundation, free housing cooperatives, the Free Pest Control program, the Free Plumbing and Maintenance program, renters assistance, legal aid, the Seniors Escorts program, and the Free Ambulance program, just to name a few. These programs were mostly run by Panther women and helped to raise public consciousness about hunger and poverty in the United States. One of the most impactful features of the Panthers' activism occurred in the Chicago chapter led by Fred Hampton. While all Panther programs redistributed wealth in society through practices of cooperative economics, Fred Hampton and the Chicago Black Panthers also built alliances by June of 1969 with the New White Left, the Communist Party, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, the Chinese American Red Guard, and the Appalachian Young Patriots as a socialist site of racial collaboration and solidarity. Each racial activist group represented a model of economic justice. The groups shared a revolutionary commitment to class, across race, the only of its kind that we've seen since its time. It's now public record that the FBI created a secret counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO that assassinated Fred Hampton and suppressed the coalition's insurgency to change the US capitalist system to a more equitable socialist one. The FBI infiltrated the Panthers and shrouded its politics, ultimately discrediting their image and repressing the organization's long-term potential. By 1971, the Black Panther Party was quickly unraveling. The greatest strengths of the Panthers' politics after 1971 were its notoriety and its concentration of relationships and resources in Oakland. Now, although Marxists and Black church folk have their differences, Cone did admit that Marxism is right in its critique of capitalism. During the Black Power movement of the 1960s, Cone urged Black churches to join it. Black Theology and Black Power was a sensational debut that not only allowed Cone to forge relationships with several leading Black nationalist groups, but Cone also played a leading role in a major nationalist group. However, Cone had experiences with the Black Panthers that made him reorder his strategic priorities. Ultimately, Cone was willing to support nationalist and Marxist organizations on a secondary basis, but resolved that his primary loyalty was to the liberationist wing of Christianity. Therefore, James Cone paved the way for this work by leading an invitation for Black churches and churches in general, and Marxists, to dialogue with one another. According to Cone, both Black churches and Marxists must be open to hearing what each is saying for dialogue to be deepened. He wrote, regardless of what happens in the dialogue between Black churches and socialists, it's clear that Black people must begin to think of a radical and total reconstruction of this society from its material economic base. Now, the Panthers emerged during the Vietnam War, a time of heightened anti-colonial sentiment in the US public square, giving them a broad base of support from allies. So my goal in this work is not to advance the Panthers' cause. Historically, outside of context, that's not even really possible. But my goal is to elevate their philosophical contributions to the field of economic theory. To put simply, the Panthers performed an important service for Black and womanist theologians. They modified European Marxist thought by emphasizing the need for poor and Black communities to gain significant control over their lives. While there's a plurality of Marxist beliefs, the Panthers fashioned a unique form of Marxist thought that was concerned specifically with Black people's abilities to control means of production and to establish themselves as unexploitable communities of resistance. The Panthers were able to present a sketch of human liberation, primarily because they stressed that people must liberate themselves from settler colonialism. So whereas racism facilitates a white settler colonial project, my book frames the need for economic drivers that facilitate visions of anti-racism through anti-colonial praxis. My goal with this research is to establish an ethical model of Black liberation rooted in labor as a resistance strategy for moral living. And so now we come to the question of, so what? In 2020, with as many as 26 million people estimated to have participated in the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw the largest protest movement in US history. Today, since 2020, data shows that the number of Black people killed by police has increased over the last 3 years. My work is necessary because we still have much work to do to counter the systemic undercurrent of state-sanctioned anti-Blackness in the United States and around the world. My research offers an invaluable contribution, not only to the field of social ethics, but also to practical models for revolutionary social practices that can build upon the revolutionary example of the Panthers. By recontextualizing their politics for the purpose of centering the most marginalized, my hope is to start a conversation about collective liberation and how we can get free of capitalist exploitation by envisioning a better society. Thank you. And so now, I would like to open it up to any questions or thoughts or discussion.
My hand's up. So I'm going to join you in a conversation. I am fascinated by point 10 in the Black Panther Party platform, which, if all of you didn't get a chance to see it close up, was about, in essence, having a UN allied alternative community for Black empowerment. That's my shortened version of it. And what's interesting to me is that it came at a time when the UN was already, if I recall the dates correctly, had already been accused of genocide. And there were other countries had expressed concern for what we were doing. And my home state of Virginia was part of it because they still practiced eugenic sterilization that affected Black persons more than others in that state. Now, that point 10 is really important for multiple reasons, because it's a place where the economic and social model proposed by Black Panthers could be lived out. But at the time it was proposed, it's almost an eschatological concept, isn't it? In that it is certainly not something that exists, but it was something that the Panthers were living into by their social action and life of resistance. So my question becomes then, to what extent were Black Panthers tangentially or even intentionally sometimes adopting reciprocally religious influences and models? Certainly Black theologians, womanist theologians saw the connections, but was it a mutual sense of connection?
That's an excellent question, Dr. Howe, and thank you for your question. You've raised many thoughts for me to consider. The first, so I want to say something directly about your question. Were the Panthers influenced by religion? Yes and no. The Panthers had a very interesting relationship to religion, and when I hear religion, right, there are different religions, so to speak, right, that come to mind. and they all interacted with the legacy of the Panthers very differently. Christianity was a tenuous, was a sort of tenuous tradition in terms of, you know, how it fit into what the Panthers' praxis was about and how they came into fruition. If you remember, you know, after the Civil Rights Movement, which was a Black pastor-led movement, you had the rise of the Black Panther Party. And although many of the organizers who joined the Panthers came out of the Civil Rights Movement and trained, you know, in Black church settings, you know, how to organize, how to, you know, basically just work as a group. You know, a lot of them felt disenchanted with the church. You know, and the strategy of nonviolence, while it was effective in the South, it didn't achieve a lot of the successes that some of the civil rights leaders, you know, thought in the North. And that opened up Christianity to a lot of critiques from the Panthers in particular, and a lot of the Black Power leaders. And so this is where somebody like Malcolm X really becomes important to the Panthers. You know, many people who sort of trace that history of the emergence of the Black Power movement understood a lot of the impetus behind that movement to come from energies and passion around Malcolm X's message. You know, Malcolm X, unlike Dr. King, you know, he was a sort of cultural revolutionary where he changed the minds of people who thought about, you know, race, right? He was somebody who, for the first time, started saying things like Black is beautiful, right? You know, before Malcolm X, there were no African-American studies departments. There were no ethnic studies departments. You know, he completely changed the way we envision Blackness. And so people look at the Black Power movement as, you know, the children of Malcolm X. But they were not explicitly Muslim, because Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam. However, that 10-point program was originally created by Malcolm X. That 10-point program was something Malcolm X created for the Nation of Islam. The Panthers took that and, you know, basically took out the Islamic flavor and made it more of a secular sort of Black Power sort of charge, right? Now, as far as the eschatological vision that the Panthers had for the future of Blackness, I love that question because, you know, today people still debate, you know, what do we do with the concept of Blackness into the future, right? I mean, we know that we're all human beings, but what do we do about Blackness? It's not something that we can ignore, right? We know that color blindness is problematic. We know that we can't be too quick to entertain a post-racial society, right? Because that would sort of reinforce escapist views of how we deal with the legacies of racism. And so the Panthers, I thought, gave a great example of, you know, how do we appropriate Blackness into a future where we do believe that, you know, all human beings are created equal. And this is a conversation in the context of what's called raciology, right? You know, how do we envision race into the future as a human race, knowing that, you know, we've sort of been racialized into different races. And in the US, that's a sort of Black-white binary. The Panthers offered a way to consider an answer to that, right? And whether it be eschatological or not, I think it is it is a way to look at Blackness within a telos, you know, Blackness with a purpose, right? It's not just saying we are Black because we want to be Black. It's saying that we are Black because we are reclaiming a segment of history, tradition, and culture that has left a memory and a mark in society, in human history, that we must learn from. And in so doing, and sort of propping up this vision of, you know, a Black community that is supposed to forge a new future. We're also saying, with the sort of economic drivers that the Panthers were promoting, that we're trying to recreate society such that we don't actually need Blackness into the future. So it was sort of a both and. It was saying, on the one hand, eschatologically speaking, we are moving towards an end that is good for everybody. But in order to get there, we need Blackness to do it. We can't ignore Blackness. And because of the way Blackness is situated in today's society, right? The whole idea that Black people are a colony in the United States, right? And around the world in places where colonialism has sort of disrupted and displaced Black people. What they're essentially saying is, we need to reclaim who we are and determine our destiny such that we can get to a place where we've established ourselves as equal, as free, and then we can consider, what it means to be members of the human race, because essentially we would have created the conditions in which to do so. I hope that answered your question, Dr. Howe. But that was a great question, and I do enjoy thinking about the relationship between religion and the Black Panthers, and also their visions for the future.
Sorry, don't know if you can see the hands in St. Paul. This is Josh Seifert.
Hey.
So you brought up a lot of this in our economics class, which I really enjoyed. I wanted to ask a question of how does your research address this model that you've been speaking of Black economic liberation within the context of Eurocentric economic imperialism that we discussed in class? You brought me on to David Chittiser and the Empire of Religion, and there's a lot of comparisons between your works as far as talking about these systemic issues that have been so deeply ingrained in history and that are perpetualized by this Western approach to economics. So I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate more about the economic model of Black liberation and how it addresses some of these deeply ingrained issues of imperialism.
Sure, yeah. So what I propose in my book is essentially a constructive ethic. And it's a way to approach a capitalist society, right? And obviously those things are connected, capitalism, imperialism. What I propose in the book is essentially called The Ethics of Dismantling. It's the entire 4th chapter, right? The Ethics of Dismantling. And that's a Black Panther inspired sort of ethical code, right? Where I'm saying that in order to move towards the possibilities or the conditions that would grant the possibilities for racial equality, what we need to do is consider what it means to dismantle a capitalist system in favor of an alternative, right? So I'm not just saying, tear it down, right, and be left with nothing. I'm saying work within the system to create alternatives to it with acute knowledge and awareness of the ways in which the system is designed to exploit marginalized communities, in particular Black people. So, it all begins really with a consciousness of the sort of insidious nature of capitalism and the way it rests on things like individuality and so on, in order to create the conditions that then use things like racism and sexism to oppress, right? Without that awareness of capitalism being the problem, it's kind of hard to move into the direction of even thinking about dismantling it or why that's necessary. And this is also something that Angela Davis taught me, because I'm building upon her work as well, but I'm also trying to create a framework, a model to consider, well, what do we do with the works that have been done, right? The research that is out there, people like Angela Davis, obviously, we went over the Panthers and James Cone. And I'm not constructing a comprehensive model for what we should do. I don't think that any one person can. I'm trying to do the humble thing by just saying, let's start a conversation. And here's a framework. Here's a way that we can approach the conversation when thinking about alternatives. And to me, that begins with an awareness of capitalism as the problem, rooted in a lot of individualism and so on, and then also a willingness to deconstruct it, dismantle it, in favor of an alternative namely collectively owned and controlled community enterprises like that of the Panthers. So again, the Panthers are really just a model that I'm trying to build upon. And I'm saying that they had it right. You know, from 1967 to 1971, their praxis was working. I mean, you know, the civil rights movement ended, the Black Power movement was in full swing. And through their community programs, you begin to see almost for the first time in the United States, you know, Black communities self-sufficient, you know, able to determine their destinies, working and owning and controlling the means of production, you know, essentially establishing themselves as unexploitable Black communities in ways that we had never seen before. The only time that we had seen anything remotely close to that was pre-civil rights, right? When you think of towns like Tulsa and Black Wall Street, you know, there were lots of economically successful Black communities that existed pre-civil rights movement in a capitalist society. However, you know, there was segregation, and that was part of the reason that they were successful. But if they got to a certain level of success, then they would get destroyed. Literally, those towns would get burned down. And so we hadn't really seen Black people, Black communities taking charge of their economic destinies in the ways that we did from 1967 to 1971 with the Panthers. And the only reason that that was not sort of, you know, successful long-term was because of FBI repression, COINTELPRO. I mean, you know, and these were things that were not, you know, taught in school. The only reason that we know COINTELPRO exists is because after the assassination of Fred Hampton, civil rights lawyers, you know, a lot of activists and Black Panther Party members, they broke into the FBI headquarters about, I think, 7 or 10 years later. And they found the files on COINTELPRO and they leaked them to the public. And that's when we learned that the FBI, the CIA, that they had been wiretapping a lot of civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, you know, included, obviously Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party. But the FBI and the CIA were very instrumental in putting an end to the efforts of the civil rights and Black power movements, particularly the praxis, because it was so effective.
Thank you.
Can you see me? Dr. Bartholomew, this is Jake.
Hey, Jake.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's really, really interesting research, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. Couple of caveats with this question. One, this may be a very basic question, so forgive me if it is. And number two, this may lie outside the scope of your constructive work. So if that's the case, you can tell me to shut up as well. But one of the things that really interests me and some of the things that I'm doing is thinking about the role that violence plays in the religious imagination, and thinking about how constructing alternative communities, communities of resistance, alternative, perhaps even economic models. And there's a lot of things swirling in my head around this question, but you know, one of the things is, in a very different context, Gutierrez holds out the possibility that violent resistance is legitimate. So thinking about the way that the role that violence plays both in asserting, maintaining, justifying a social status quo, and then also in resistance. Does your research or the type of conversation you're wanting us to enter into, or the type of model that you're proposing perhaps, does it speak into this ongoing debate within Christian theology and ethics as well, with regard to how do we think about the role that violence plays in the construction of alternative communities? So it's kind of an open-ended question, but.
I love that question, Jake. You know, I think that's an exciting question because I think it it really touches on a lot of the things that are just intriguing about the Panthers if you don't know anything about them, right? And the Panthers knew this, right? While a lot of the historical record of the Panthers, even when you watch a movie or see a documentary, they focus on the guns. They focus on their willingness to defend, right, by any means necessary. And they kind of romanticize their image in that way, right? Which, that was an effective strategy even then. I will say that much. I don't think that we should discredit the public theater involved with the way the Panthers presented themselves, right? I think they were smart for two reasons. One, the United States has always had a fear of Black communities after slavery, right? This idea that Black people will retaliate for all of the brutality. And the Panthers knew this, right? And they were juxtaposing themselves with a Dr. King and the nonviolence of the civil rights movement. But the real thing that I love about the Panthers, right, is not only that they played on those fears, because they weren't actually, remember, they were a Black Panther Party of self-defense. They weren't actually on the attack ever. That was never their MO. But they were smart because, once you went to a Panther meeting, if you asked for a gun, they wouldn't give you one. You would have to read books first, right? The gun was the hook. They understood what would capture people's imaginations, right? People had never really seen a sort of disciplined, no-nonsense racial activist group of this kind. But you went to a meeting, you had to read, you had to learn the sort of political education of who the Panthers were. Now, all of that is to say the Panthers were vilified as dangerous and violent, right? But, that's because there's a common law code that says Black people are never supposed to defend themselves against white racism and violence. And because the Panthers were willing to do so, they put themselves at risk of, the white media, who would spin the story and always kind of paint them out as the bad guys, right? Today, that can't happen as easily because we have social media, we have camera phones, we have, what is it, Twitter or something else now? X, right? But the idea is you have so many ways to get counter narratives out there now that you can't really pigeonhole people into a particular image these days, right? And so the Panthers never attacked with violence. They attacked with political strategy. You see, and that was something that I really wanted to get through, not just in my presentation, but in my book. I really wanted people to understand we never really understood the Panthers from what the media told us. We never actually knew that they were economic philosophers, that these were social theorists first, right? Huey Newton had a PhD. People don't know these things. People don't know that, these people were invested in the life of the mind and interested in thinking up strategy. I mean, this was 100 years after Reconstruction, where they basically had to read. They had to read and think critically about how do we come up with a model, an economic philosophy, a way forward, philosophically speaking, so that we don't get killed by the superstructure. Everybody knew at the time, in the civil rights movement, the Black Power, everybody knew, if we're going up against the US system, we're going to lose. We don't have tanks. We don't have helicopters. We don't have all these things, right? But they understood that at the end of the day, it was more of them in terms of not just Black people, but poor people. There were more poor people than there were rich people and people in power. And so their whole mission was to make people make a decision, right? By feeding kids, by giving free healthcare, by changing all these modalities for services, public services. They were essentially forcing people to choose between a capitalist society and a power structure and the people. Do we want to control our destinies? Do we want to control how we live our lives? Even when it comes down to how we produce, how we make money, what we work to do, right? Do we want to do meaningful work, or do we want to work for people, right? And basically contract out our time and labor, right? they forced people to consider the option that people can invest in themselves. And they didn't have to sell out to a system that ultimately, if it didn't have their best interest in mind, they still had to kind of participate in that system, right? That's how the Panthers were on the offense. Their offense was never violent, right? In the sense that you would think of the sort of U.S. industrial military complex or something like that. And the irony is they were met with violence. They were met with violence repeatedly. And it's because of that violence, we have lost a huge part of American history and world history that I'm trying to reclaim in my book.
Whew. Thank you. My goodness. Was there one more? Yeah, I saw that you had your.
Yolanda had her.
Oh, two more people. Okay, two people. All right.
Okay, am I next?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, because I don't know if I'm getting a chance, so I'm gonna ask two questions, Dr. Bartholomew, Yolanda Byers. Okay, so it's my first question, but they kind of go together. First question is, based on your study and research, do you believe, given what we've seen in the praxis or practice of what I'll call Western Christianity, and the fundamental elements of the Black Panther Party, do you believe they're diametrically opposed? That's my first question. My second question is, as you so rightly pointed out during your presentation, we all unfortunately had experienced the last 3.5 years approximately during COVID, and we got to know ourselves, we got to know our neighbors, we got to know the people we lived with, we got to understand more about the people perhaps even that were our neighbors and that maybe we went to church and school with. So given all of these conditions and their intersectional nature of race, politics, gender, economics, and white Christian nationalism, as you so rightly talked about, where do we go from here? Because we already know, as you pointed out, Black Wall Street was crushed, and every great African-American leader, not every great, but many of them, not all, but many of them, their efforts were circumvented. We know by CIA, FBI, and others, or those that were connected to that world. Where do we go from here? Where do we go as many of us being Christ followers, students in seminary, some practicing pastors, and others, I would say in Christendom? Where do we go from here?
Thank you, Yolanda. You asked some really great questions. The first question is Western Christianity diametrically opposed to the BPP? Yes and no, right? And that was the sort of tricky part about what Cone did, right? He was sort of in a position where, he wasn't Black nationalist enough for the Black nationalists, but he wasn't, Christian enough for some of the Christian, because he was in that space where he was trying to urge Christians to join the Black Power movement. But he himself did not want to become solely a Black nationalist. He wanted to remain a Christian, and sort of and dedicate his life to the liberationist wing of Christianity. So I would say Cone, and this is why Cone is so impactful to me, because he kind of creates that way for Christians to enter into this conversation, right? He kind of creates that third way. We call it Black theology, but really he put language to a feeling that I think many Black people have around knowing the problems, right? Or critiques that come from sort of that colonial Christianity that we all inherit. But he deepens it with the consciousness of the Black experience. And I think up until his point, there hadn't really been anybody else who tried to break through it and connect it with Marxist thinkers, particularly secular thinkers like the Black Panther Party. I think for that reason, Malcolm X probably had a little bit more freedom, as a religious leader, to impact the Black community. I think once you look at people like Dr. King and then Dr. Cone, using Christianity has its limitations. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my book, right? I'm trying to break through that sort of wall where as Christians, especially Black Christians, we don't always see the need to look beyond, what we've inherited from the church into other contexts for ideas, specifically philosophical ideas and strategies, right? Models for praxis that may not necessarily be inherently religious, right? Because the Panthers were not a religious organization. I think Huey himself actually was. I think he was an atheist, or he had a way of not really talking about God in some of his beliefs. And look, there's good reason, right, for why churches, whether they be Black or white or any kind of church, right, would be in tension with a group like the Panthers or a legacy like the Panthers or praxis like the Panthers, right? I think for what it's worth, churches do fit neatly within a capitalist context. And the Panthers, they never did. They just never did. That was not their design. So I think, until we are willing to wrestle with that tension, this is going to be our reality where, we're constantly looking for ways to combat racism that may not be as adequate, right? If we're not dealing with the sort of capitalist foundation out of which it lives and exists. And to your second question, where do we go from here? I'm hoping to find out, right? I mean, look, I wrote my book again because I'm trying to start a conversation. I didn't want to jump too far ahead and start giving a lot of prescriptions, only because I'm one person, and I do believe in joining forces with lots of other people who have visions, who have ways of looking at the same issue, and hopefully, you use similar methods and methodologies to arrive at a critique of capitalism and the need for an alternative. I'm hoping that with a mosaic of visions, we can have a better picture that doesn't just come from me or any one group of people, right? I do think that everybody has a stake in this conversation. And I'm trying to start this book to frame that conversation, at least for people who are interested in thinking about these things, and for people who may not know that this is a really necessary part of the conversation in racial justice. But I think until then, right now it's just me. And I'm doing my best to kind of think up, ways to get forward, to move forward. But, I don't want to, I don't just want to assume that I have all the answers and that, I can come up with some comprehensive vision all by myself. I do believe it will take a village, it will take communities, and it will take a lot of collaboration.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so very much. And what rich conversation and so deep information that we just received. It's something that you just cannot just take a little bit, and it's something that you have to let continue to work in your mind and have these conversations because it's deep. And as we work towards collective liberation and freedom, it takes all of us. So I thank you again, Dr. Bartholomew, so very much. If there are questions that are left there, we're gonna have something called like outtakes. I don't know a real name, but you have to type them into the chat, and then Dr. Bartholomew will answer. Oh, wait. Email.
It's in the chat.
Okay, email Julian, and it's in the chat where his email address is in the chat. And Dr. Bartholomew will answer it, and we add it to the recording so you can hear the other questions that we didn't get to cover at this time, because we just have this little time frame. So thank you so very much. And blessings on to the rest of your day. And as we go forward, let us go forward with a mind open to make some change, because we can do it. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Hi, my name is Dr. Joshua Bartholomew, Assistant Professor of Ethics, Church, and Society at St. Paul School of Theology. We recently had a forum last Tuesday, September 19th, on my book, Black Theology and the Black Panthers. Thank you for those who were able to attend. And right now, we're just taking some time to address some questions people had that we couldn't get to before the end of the forum. So this first question is, did I study or identify any alignment or disparities between the Black Panther Party's mission and the current theological missions in the church as a whole? And by this, this person wonders how current Christian theology, albeit fractured in practice, compares with the Black Panther Party's emphasis on equity. So the whole crux of my project was really to build on themes that connected the Black Panther Party and churches, specifically prophetic ministries. The major theme that connected the Black Panther Party's praxis, specifically from 1967 to 1971, and a lot of activist armors of churches, was the theme of liberation. So liberation obviously is a huge theme in Black theology. It's sort of the platform upon which Black theology interprets the gospel. It's the gospel of liberation. And the Black Panther Party's mission essentially was to liberate Black communities from systemic oppression and create pathways towards self-determination of Black communities. So, liberation was a huge theme that I see connecting really the main push and motivations behind the Black Panther Party, and ultimately, what I believe the message of the gospel is, which is, liberation, not just personal salvation, but liberation as well from oppressive social structures. This next question, did the Black Panther Party become more active after Dr. King's assassination? Yes. I think a lot of people were angry after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I can tell you a personal story about, what people in communities were doing after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I spoke with a fellow church member. At the time, I was sort of writing this book, and this person in particular was alive during the time of the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. And they were, they grew up in Boston, in Roxbury, Massachusetts, where I grew up as well, historically Black neighborhood. Actually, it's where Malcolm X lived during his time before he moved to New York as a child. But, this individual told me that when, and this individual also happens to be Black, and was a community organizer and sort of active in activist spaces at the time. And they mentioned that, when Dr. King was assassinated, there was a collective rage that sort of swept across the community. And he himself was interested in joining the Black Panther Party at that time. I think a lot of people who were proponents of Dr. King's nonviolent strategies to bring about social change really felt hopeless when Dr. King was assassinated. And the Black Panther Party, emerged at that time to kind of fill that void of questions people had around, where do we go? What do we do? How do we take our anger? How do we take our momentum from the civil rights movement and transform it into something productive? The Panthers were able to galvanize that momentum, galvanize the anger, but also organize it and discipline it into a movement for economic praxis. So, I think for what it's worth, the assassination of Dr. King actually emboldened a lot of the momentum that became what eventually became the Black Panther Party. another question, did Dr. King at least appreciate some of what the Panthers were trying to do? Yeah, Dr. King, while he was different than the Panthers in some of his economic philosophies, meaning, the Panthers were Black socialists. Dr. King, I wouldn't define him as a Black socialist. He never called for the abolition of private property, or land, or so on and so forth. And, a lot of his Poor People campaign was strategic in that, he was really just trying to widen his political base of support and focus on non-race-based issues and really bring together different classes across lines of race to sort of strengthen a more democratic voice of the people. Now, he did understand the Panthers to be a little more radical than what he was proposing, in that, he felt that the anger of the Panthers, and I'm gonna try to remember this quote, but he said that the anger of the Panthers really indicated a sense of hopelessness that the younger generation had been feeling. But Dr. King, I believe, from history, really wanted to hold on to a sense of hope and try to work within the country, within the systems of the country, of the United States, to achieve some type of social justice, some type of social change. Whereas the Panthers, they really wanted to work within the system, but to create an alternative system within the system, such that ultimately the kind of equity they wanted to achieve would have been socialist. They wanted to replace the capitalist system with the socialist one. So there was some overlap in the way that they understood economic justice to be central to their praxis and their mission around racial equality. But I would say, whereas King held on to some of the hope to maybe change the country, he saw the Panthers' sort of revolutionary spirit of socialism as an indictment that perhaps some hope may have been lost in the younger generation, and some more extreme measures had to be taken. This last statement about People United for Sustainable Housing and the disruption efforts in Buffalo, New York, and wanting to know my opinion on the efforts of groups like PUSH and other similar initiatives. I think a group like PUSH, if they are challenging capitalist power structures for affordable housing, green zone development, and other initiatives like that, I think that sounds good. I think that any type of advocacy that really pushes up against the capitalist system to affect some type of long-lasting change is important. I also think that one difference between an organization like PUSH and I don't know much about PUSH, and that is to say, when I compare them to an organization like the Black Panther Party, the Black Panthers were widespread. They had local chapters all over the country. I don't know if PUSH has local chapters all over the country. I don't know if they are national or international in scope. But I would say that any group that is doing grassroots disruption praxis or any type of economic praxis that challenges settler colonialism, the greater the buy-in, the more probability of success you have, right? The greater you can achieve with more bandwidth. The Panthers having chapters all around the country really helped their momentum, their efforts, their notoriety, and that's a really important piece of the conversation when thinking and talking about what do we need to do in order to affect social change. You need buy-in. You need as many people to support your cause, whether they be in
local chapters or, you know, other organizations that come together under a coalition umbrella. But no, I mean, Push sounds great. And, you know, I would want any organization that is doing social justice work, you know, in the right way, to have the kind of support and broad-based bandwidth that a group like the Black Panther Party had.